They came in the brittle light of a late autumn morning, soft dust kicking at their boots, their papers crackling like dry leaves. I could see the lines of oath and ink in the hands of the man who called himself a marshal. And I could see the impatience in the eyes of the railroad men behind him, the kind of impatience that knows it will make money whether or not anyone lives on the land. They stood at the edge of my garden, where chilies and echinacea still clung to stubborn fruit, and announced the government's decree with all the polite cruelty of men who have never had a mother bury a child. "I'll need to see your claim," the marshal said. He wore a pressed shirt and a conscience tailored thin as a ribbon. The paper he showed me had been filed months before by a company with more lawyers than sense. They called it eminent domain, progress, the march of trains and telegraph lines. They called what they wanted right of way. They did not call it what it was, an order that would rip the heart of my community from the prairie and put us on a wagon to nowhere. I was 38. They could see the silver in my braid, the weather-darkened skin on my forearms from years of tending the herb beds and stitching wounds. I had a name that belonged to wind and water, Aiyana, and a house built by the hands of a people who had always tended the land. I was a healer. I read bones and blood and the stubborn habits of fever. I had sat up through nights when pneumonia took boys not yet old enough for a name, sewn shut women who died in childbirth because the nearest doctor would not cross the river, and made salves that traded, in the years before the railroad men came, for flour and a promise of kin. But loss had already sat at my hearth many winters. My brother, taken by a fever that came in the season of the rains. My husband, a quiet man who had loved the soil and did not live to see the seasons change twice after the fence gathering began. I had learned to hold grief like a secret medicine, wrap it neat, hide the bitter, name the part that would heal. Still, the notice that shoved its paper into my hands was a different kind of cut. This time, they were not asking my people to move because the prairie ran out. They were giving me a choice: lie about my claim, hand over the little homestead where I had set bones and planted seeds, or be moved by force. They wanted me to sign away the land where my medicine jar sat on the windowsill, where the stories of my grandmother had been hung in the rafters, where I had painted an eagle in soot above my door to watch the river. They wanted my privacy, my patience, the trust that had been earned in quiet rooms and late-night comings and goings. They wanted the place where my life stitched itself to the land. I thought of the faces that had come to me, women whose babies I had pulled, farmers whose fever I had cooled with willow bark, a schoolteacher who had learned to write with dirt-stained fingers and dropped by when the fever passed to bring me books she had traded for eggs. I thought of them standing at a crossroads with the law where they had never been given a map. "You'll have 30 days, the marshal told me. The government will assist in relocation. You'll be compensated." A laugh rose out of the years I had kept in my chest, the sound of someone who had been promised things and never seen the giving. The men shifted and looked toward each other as if the problem could be passed like a package. I was fragile in the way people are when they've lost something large. You measure the rest of the world against the empty place on your shelf. But where they saw vulnerability, I felt something else, an ember that had been banked under ash. I could have done what they wanted. I could have signed for a cash sum tied to the value of land they did not care to value correctly. I could have left with the others, formed the procession of the dispossessed down the wagon road, and swallowed my pride along with my elderberry roots. But there were two things they did not know. They had not seen the ledger of people who came to my door in winter and left with a plant and the instructions that saved a child. And they had never encountered a woman who would let injustice be served with a smile. The decision I made in that moment was not romantic. It wasn't a bold proclamation shouted across the prairie. It was a quiet, practical reckoning. I would not sign, I would not leave. I would protect what belonged to me by whatever means I could. It was a choice born from the same place that had taught me to stitch a wound. It was necessary, precise, and a little reckless. 3 days later, I found a stranger at the edge of the ash trees by the arroyo. A man with the sheen of death on his lips and a rattle of fear in his hand. His leg had been struck by a rattlesnake. The bite was fresh, and the swelling had begun to paint the flesh a bruised purple. His eyes were wild, but there was a ledger tucked into his satchel, a smear of ink bleeding into the leather. He groaned when I touched his shoulder. I did not know his name, only that he had no right to my land and everything to gain by using me. He was an outlaw, I would learn later. One of those men who moved through towns like a rumor. He was also human and in need of help. A healer's hands do not scan for titles before they treat. They measure pulse and breath and the demand of pain. I lifted him onto a blanket, set a poultice of crushed comfrey and sage to the wound, and carried him home while the wind watched me like a curious thing. I made a decision then that would change the arc of my life. I sheltered the man. I hid him in the attic under bundles of the late chest herbs that filled my cupboards. I fed him nettle tea and chewed willow bark until my mouth went numb. In the quiet between pulse checks, watching the slow swallow of sleep under my hands, I glimpsed the ledger tied to his satchel, a heavy book of names and receipts, and a thin thread of corruption that smelled like smoke. My choice was dangerous. But in the wash of days after the marshal left and the railroad men tightened their sour smiles into plans, danger had begun to look like a useful teacher. I would not accept being moved like furniture. I would not let the stories of my people be packed into wagons labeled progress. I had a medicine chest, a handful of women who trusted me, and a stubbornness that refused to be stove out. If taking in an outlaw was what it took to keep my land, then I would be audacious enough to do it. I had never been a woman to flinch at the smell of trouble. Every wound I had closed taught me that chaos was mostly anatomy. Identify the source, apply the right pressure, wait. The man in my attic breathed raggedly and kept one hand curled like a child's over the satchel with the ledger. He had a name he offered with a rasp, Gideon Mercer, but names are a currency that can be traded as easily as a horse. I offered him water and silence. When his fever broke enough to let him talk, Gideon told me enough to place him, unmoored, hunted, a man who had once worked the lines and the towns, who had tried to make a living honestly until honesty made him a scribe of lies. He had stumbled into a ledger kept by the men who wanted our land, the company men and the marshal who took orders in quiet tones. In those pages were names and bribes, orders rubber-stamped by a court clerk, whose pockets were as deep as the river in spring. Gideon had seen what the railroad was willing to do to claim land, and then he'd been marked for it. No, I said first. It was a practical no, the kind I used when a fever wanted to set and there was a cup of cold water on the table. I can't hand you to men who will hang you for saving a piece of paper. Gideon's jaw hardened, in that way a man's does when he recognizes the stakes are higher than his own life. They'll kill me to keep it quiet, he said. If I had the ledger, I could ruin them. I set my palm against the rough of his knuckles. I don't know how to ruin a man with a ledger, I told him. I know how to save a life. I know how to make a salve that keeps a wound from festering. I know how to make the town's women trust me. If there's truth in those pages, it will take more than a ledger to topple them. It will take people. That was the crux of it. I was a woman who had patched up bodies and spirits, not a gunslinger with a rope for justice. But justice is often a collage of small acts, gathering testimony, distributing truth like seed. Gideon could bring me the ledger. I could bring him women who had been wronged, names of men who had been cheated, the rhythm of nights where reputations had been shredded. Between us there was a way to make the corruption visible. Once the truth had weight, men who thought themselves insulated would find themselves clumsy. So we made rules in the hush of my attic. He would not go poking at the marshal's men in the open. I would not put myself in sight of the men who'd begun to circle like wolves, scenting a new kill. We would be cautious. We would also be honest about who we were and what we wanted. Honesty is a curious salve. It heals distrust faster than any herb. Gideon showed me the ledger when his hand steadied. It was a dog-eared beast of paper and ink, names written in a hand that had the sweat of men who had decided other people's lives. There were receipts for assistance to officials who processed claims, ledger lines for a relocation fund, and invoices for men who had been paid to gentle resistance. The ink bled where hands had been less careful, and the pages were damp with the evidence of a life on the run. "You want out," I said, turning a page with a thumb gentle as a midwife's. "You want to get out and take that ledger somewhere safe." He nodded. "If it were just me, I'd burn it and run. But burning it won't help the people who were cheated." "You'll have to trust me," I said. Trust was a fragile thing in my world. It was earned in late-night stitches and shared smoke. He offered it like a crumb from a man who had little left. We had to vanish for a while. The first night after he came to me, a pair of men came to the edge of my yard under the pretense of checking fence lines. They asked simple questions. Who lived here? Who had been seen around after dark? The marshal had sent them. I answered as the situation required, because I am not reckless. The men left with a nod that was meant to be harmless, and I watched the sun pull its skirts away from the hills and felt the prickle of being in the crosshairs anew. Gideon and I devised a way out that was not the sort of plan that would become legend. It was a plan of small cunning. He would travel to the supply town further downriver under the pretense of being a stable hand, finding work where men needed muscle and an untraceable face. Meanwhile, I would keep the ledger hidden in a locked chest beneath the floorboards of my house, where no government man would think to look, because they were not the kind to think beyond the surface of what they sought. On the day he left, I dressed him in the plain coat of a laborer and stitched a patch over the shoulder where a brand might have been. He carried a sack with a loaf of my cornbread and a flask of my chokecherry cordial. "Be careful," I told him, not as a lover might, though there was a softness there I had not planned for, but as a fellow person might. There was no pretense that I was saving him to be saved. This was an alliance built on mutual need and respect. As he went, a wind rose that seemed to clear the world. He paused at the tree line and did something like look back. I met his gaze, and in that quick, breath-stilled pause, I felt something shift. Respect had been earned on both sides. He had kept himself alive with whatever means the road offered, and I had kept my hearth by a stubborn refusal to budge. Between us, the ledger became less a single thread and more a skein we could untangle together. Before he left for the town, Gideon did something unexpected. He bowed his head in a way that was almost reverent and said, "Ma'am Aiyana, if I come back with more trouble than I left, you have the right to cast me out." "No," I answered, surprising myself with the firmness of it. "If you come back, you come because you intend to help. If you betray these people, you will not find clemency here." He smiled, the first real smile I had seen on him, a crooked thing that folded the pain from his face into lines of humor and humility. "Then consider me signed," he said. The unusual partnership took root in the light of necessity, and in the hush of that absinthe dawn, I felt the first unfurling of a will within me that would not be intimidated by printed paper. I had sheltered a man who could be dangerous. He had offered a ledger that might become armor. We were an unlikely pair, a Comanche healer who kept her kin's secrets in jars on a shelf, and an outlaw whose ledger smelled faintly of tobacco and guilt. Together, we moved forward under the quiet oath of people who had been pushed to the edge and had decided not to step off it. If there is a medicine to becoming something other than what the world insists on calling you, it is time, patient care, and the stubborn repetition of small tasks. For 3 weeks after Gideon left to take his place among unmarked laborers in the supply town, I returned to my routines, because routines are a kind of prayer I know by heart. I tended the herbs before dawn, lit the inside of my house like an ember, brewed teas for the widow across the road whose cough had the rasp of a winter river, and stitched the torn pocket of the schoolteacher who traded spelling lessons for bandages. Those acts kept the ledger from swallowing me whole, because tending others keeps a healer from sinking into the rot of her own grief. The women in our cluster, Maria, the widow who ran the boarding house, Lottie, the schoolteacher with iron straight posture and laughter in her hands, and Cora, who kept a few head of cattle, came by in quiet hours. They brought me bread, and in exchange, I gave them a paste to soothe a child's fever and secrets to make them feel less alone. They were not warriors, not in the way men wore the word, but there was a power in their tenderness that practical men often mistook for weakness. They had names that mattered in the ledger of the prairie: midwives and cooks, teachers and laundresses. Each had a small, fierce autonomy because they had to craft lives that would survive whether men promised or not. Being a healer is not just about the hands, it is about the decisions. I began to test my own limits while keeping my hearth doors bolted. How much could I ask of a man like Gideon? How much risk could I take in speaking against the railroad and the courthouse? The ledger had given me glimpses of the pattern. A clerk's hand here, a series of payments there. It made me see the systemic cruelty in a way that made me both furious and oddly clinical. If I were to take action, it would be with intention and precision, not wild, hollow cries. I taught myself to be a different kind of fierce. I started with what I knew. I taught Maria to ferment herbs into tinctures she could sell, turning the brand of native folk medicine into a small trade that gave her independence and, crucially, a reason to speak with women who would not normally have spoken to one another. Lottie began to record names, small nods of memory that could be turned into testimony. She shadowed me as I tended to those who bore the quiet marks of injustice, a widow whose son had been accidentally arrested by men with no patience for questions, a blacksmith whose land had been refiled in the name of a company man, a teacher who had been pressured to lend her schoolroom to a surveyor in the name of progress. In those afternoons, I saw my strength bloom, not like a sudden blinding sunrise, but like the patient unfurling of spring bulbs. My hands, which had mended so many fractured things, learned to steady a pen the same way they steadied forceps. I translated the ledger's dry ink into the language of the people. Names that could be cross-checked, dates that matched when men came and men left, receipts that could be traced to the ledger if someone brave enough sought the right counter at the right time. Gideon returned once in that time, his clothes smelling of tack and river dust, his face creased with the new map of labor. He'd come with a plan to get himself closer to the men who managed the rails. If he could move into the company lines and read what they chose to think secret, he was careful to respect my boundaries. "Whatever you plan," he said, "you make the decision." That line, a small and careful absolution of agency, floated through me like a benediction. He deferred to me in the way that men who have been reformed by dignity sometimes do, not submissively, but in recognition that I had insight he did not. We began to move as a pair whose center was not the ledger alone, but the people it threatened. Gideon learned the names of those I treated, and in exchange, I taught him which herbs acted as counteragents to the bite of worry, how to make a calming tincture, and how to wrap a hand to hold a man's courage steady. In the evenings, we sat across from one another and shared small histories. Gideon told me about being on the railroad when the first lines cut into prairie and tree, and how men like himself were paid to keep people moving if they were an inconvenience. He had started honest, mending engines and learning the mathematics of schedules and track. Then he had seen men in suits with their smiles slick with grease, buying notice and signatures. He had tried to expose them, and the retaliation had been precise. The ledger had become his witness. I told him about my grandmother, who taught me that a person is more than what they lose. She'd been a healer who kept a ledger of a different sort, stories of births and funerals, the names of children who had been baptized beneath stars. The ways a woman's face changes when she learns that she need not be small. That ledger belonged to memory and was heavier because of love. We built a sanctuary in the small ways we could, patching the roof where the winter wind prodded the rafters, sanding down a table where we would set the ledger when the time came, stashing jars of marigold and arnica beneath the floorboards. The house itself began to feel like a reclamation, the soot-streaked walls painted with a bright band of ochre where I hung a woven banner, the single pane of glass in the window replaced with a salvage pane from an old greenhouse. Each repair said we would not be moved without a fight. Between our quiet evenings and the small commerce of salves, we began to talk instead of barter. We argued about the ledger, about the risk of exposing men who could buy people and courts and papers. We argued about what mattered most, land or justice. In the end, our arguments were not fights, but cartography, mapping who we were and who we wanted to be. One night, sitting by the wood stove, Gideon asked me, "If you had to choose, would you stay here even if it cost you everything else?" I held the cup of tea in both hands and felt the warmth where my fingers met clay. "I would stay if I could make it safer for the ones who have nowhere else to go," I said, thinking of Maria and Lottie and the children who whispered my name like it might be a charm. Gideon reached for my hand then, a small deliberate touch that was not a claim. "Then we'll make it safer," he said. It was not a promise I took lightly. Between the slow work of women who traded recipes for rent and the sudden, precise work of an outlaw with a ledger, a plan was forming. Less dramatic than you'd see in the newspapers, but no less determined. We would gather testimony, secure the ledger, and seek a way to turn the law onto those who had used it as a cloak. My strength, which had been forged in the quiet rooms of the sick and the dying, began to find a new muscle in the public arena. I was no longer only a healer of flesh. I was becoming a healer of the community's ability to stand. There is a medicine in telling a story and having it heard. Gideon's past, what made him a fugitive and what gave him the ledger, became a tool for what I needed to do. He read train schedules like scripture, knew the names of men who had been transferred between towns when the ledger hinted at their footprints, and crucially, he had a skill for slipping where suspicion slept. He could disappear into a crowd and return with a pocketful of facts that, when arranged properly, would form the outline of wrongdoing. He told me his tale without the theatrics of heroes. He had not been born a villain. The road had favored him and taken him in its turn. He had been a yard clerk for a short stretch, a man who wound bolts and fitted ties, had trusted the men who offered whiskey and promises, and had watched patience be bought with a pencil. When he found the ledger, an innocuous book left in a foreman's office like any other, he'd intended to use it to make himself a better man. It had turned him into a target. He'd been a whistleblower of a sort, but in a world that rewarded money more than truth, whistleblowers were often muffled. Gideon's skills offered me the possibility of turning my reputation into leverage. He could trace which men had authorized the relocation files, which notary had signed papers without being present, and which surveyors had neglected to note the sacred sites in favor of a straight line. His criminal knowledge, how to bribe a man not to speak, how to read a ledger and see where papers had been manufactured, became an asset. That was the strange symmetry of our lives. I healed bodies, he revealed hypocrisy. Together we could do what neither of us could have done alone. "You're not just a woman with a stubborn streak," he said once, as we leaned over the ledger and compared dates. "You know how to make people listen." "Women listen," I told him dryly. "We listen because we have to. But sometimes we don't get heard because the men write the minutes." He scribbled a note, an editorial habit of his. He wrote down a cluster of dates and names that matched a string of forced relocations, where men had been convinced to sign papers in the presence of a marshal who had looked the other way. There were invoices for transportation assistance that had been paid in cash to men who had vacated. There were names of deputies who had beaten more than they had arrested. When Gideon entered the company rings, He did so under the guise of needing work. He allowed himself to be catalogued as a hired hand, harmless and useful, but he kept his eyes like a hawk. He knew which men kept their conscience in a desk drawer and which wore it on a chain. He learned how the company laundered land claims, how they moved signatures between papers like beads on a string until the original choices were lost. He discovered the names of the men who had overseen the relocate, men who passed notes in the corner of the room and named prices that smelled like bedrock theft. I watched him when he came back from those excursions, the ledger a little larger, with the remnants of the truth. He was not a saint. He drank too much when the night was hard and chewed at the leather strap of his satchel with anxious teeth. He had been changed by being hunted. Still, he moved through the world with an efficiency I admired. The outlaw had a pragmatic heart. He believed in writing his own ledger, even if it meant dirt under his nails. But Gideon's past came with its own cost. His reputation made some of my patients balk. "You let him in?" a woman asked once, the underside of her gaze sharp with worry. I had to explain that everyone had some mess in their past. I also had to explain why a man like Gideon could be useful, though I did it carefully, because trust is a tender thing, and community trust is harder to mend than a child's pulse. "How do you know he won't burn everything down?" Maria asked, folding dough with fingers that knew the rhythm of patience. "Because he has something to lose now," I said, "and because I'm making sure he knows that he answers to something more than himself." Gideon learned to listen, not just to the ledger, but to the women I served, to the way a widow said the name of a man she had lost without accusing the world, but expecting that it should be answered. He learned the small codes of a healer's trust. In return, I learned the ways of the papers, how to make a request for documents that would not be instantly denied, how to find where the courthouse kept its less public books. He taught me how to move without drawing a man's suspicion, how to make a false footstep and leave the real one hidden. Our relationship evolved into a partnership of complementary skills. We were two halves of a one-woman, two-man operation, not because one of us could not stand alone, because we both could, but because together our capacities multiplied. His insider knowledge could be weaponized into a public case if we had witnesses, records, and a woman who knew how to talk to juries whose hearts had been mistreated. I was practical and careful. He was daring in a way that bordered on rabid when provoked. But crucially, he put his shoulder to the wheel only when I asked him to. "What's the end game?" he asked, the night we mapped the schedule of the courthouse and compiled the ledger pieces. He spoke in terms of railway timetables, as if justice had a station to arrive at. "The end game is that they cannot take this land by fraud," I told him. "The end game is that women can keep their houses, that the children who learned their letters from Lottie can still go to the school under the sycamore. If the law is broken against us, we'll make them answer in a court that still believes in ink and witness." He nodded. "And if the court is compromised, then we make them compromise themselves," I said. That was a dangerous thing to say aloud, and it required a kind of moral calculation I would not take lightly. I did not want to corrupt myself for justice, but I would use whatever tools I had, stories, women's labor, a ledger, a man who could get into closed offices to make the fabric of our lives visible enough that it could not be ignored. As we moved through months of careful plotting, Gideon's story and skills did not eclipse mine. They were a scaffold for a house I was already building. He deferred to my judgment when it mattered and asked permission when he took liberty. His outlawness was a tool, not the master. He used his past to serve my future, not to define it. Justice, when you look for it, is less a singular blow than a sequence of actions that converge to reveal truth. My fight was not a child's tantrum, but a long, merciless labor. The injustice I had endured was personal and community-wide. The state's willingness to treat people as obstacles to rail beds, the companies that broke promises with signatures and whiskey, the marshal who read his orders not as a mandate to protect citizens, but as instructions to clear the way. My life had been stitched by hands that now found themselves forced to unthread by men who called it progress. I had lost relatives to preventable illness, sure, and my husband's absence was a hollow that never stopped echoing. But the relocation notice cut differently. It was not a private grief. It was an attempt to remove my people from the map entirely, forgetting the graves, the places where songs had been sung, the medicine that grew in particular soil. I had listened to enough of their legal jargon and felt the brittle dishonesty. I knew what would happen if people like me were moved to make a straight, cold track for something otherwise indifferent to our lives. Gideon's ledger had given us names, men who had signed away rights with a lack of curiosity that could only be described as willful negligence. Deputies who had overseen resettlement with heavy hands and quick ledgers, and surveyors who had made lines that ignored the places where my people had always considered sacred. The pattern was clear. Paperwork had been manufactured and witnesses given inadequate notice. Women had been coerced, names pressured by a marshal who smiled too easily. That is corruption in the daylight, simple, efficient. It finds a desk and wears it like a cloak. I had to decide what I would do with that knowledge. The simplest path would have been to hide the ledger again and keep my mouth closed. Another path, riskier and more righteous, was to gather witnesses and make those men answer where their own rules pretended to hold. The choice belonged to me. No one else could make it. The ledger had dropped into my hands in a moment of fate, but what I did with it would define me. I called a meeting in the schoolhouse one evening. The women came one by one, their faces lit by the single kerosene lamp. Some brought their children, some a pot of stew to share. Maria set an extra chair because her habit was to make room. Lottie sat in front with a neat pencil and a steady hand, ready to record. I laid the ledger on the table. The room hummed with a noise like a bee's nest, the nervous energy that happens when people gather and suspect they may finally be given the means to act. I told them about the marshal's visit, about the 30-day notice, about the way men in suits had begun to knock on doors with smiles like razors. I spoke plainly about the ledger and what it contained. Faces hardened. Some women folded their arms like shields. Others looked away. "We can take this to the court," Lottie said. "We can show them the ledger and the receipt." "And if the court is paid off?" Maria asked. "If the magistrate finds his pockets full and his conscience thin?" We had to consider contingency. We would not rush to a courthouse without witnesses. I knew that the law beloved of men could be bought, but the force of community testimony and a paper trail could be harder to overturn if made public. We could create pressure. We could make lawsuits, but also make noise. Letters to editors, the school teachers' notes published in town, women testifying in front of crowds. Public opinion was clumsy, but it could be used. I thought of women's hands, how they moved through kitchens and fields and prayer circles. Their words could move more than windows. They moved the world in small ways that, added together, changed the architecture of power. We made a list. Names of women who had been forced to sign relocation papers, men whose land had been refiled, children whose schools had been closed in the name of easements. We cross-referenced dates. We wrote pleadings and petitions. We collected receipts and photographs when we could, a rare commodity, but Lottie had managed to find a clerk sympathetic enough to let her copy the pages she needed. We taught women how to speak in court, how to keep a steady voice, how to answer direct questions, how to hold their faces like statements. There were hard choices. One woman, Sarah, whose husband had been beaten by a deputy months before, wanted vengeance more than justice. She wanted to tear the marshal's windows, to take a hot iron to the ledger and watch the men sweat. She would have done well in any tavern that honored anger. I told her, kindly but firmly, that we needed her courage in the form of testimony. "We need your witness in court," I said. "We need your story, so when they go to brand you liar, we will have proof." She agreed, though reluctantly, because anger can be shaped. It is not wrong to be furious. It is wrong sometimes to wield fury in a way that leaves you alone in the rubble. We took her statement carefully and documented the injuries with a physician's note I had signed, a small act of forensic care that would matter in a courtroom. The ledger had opened a path, yes, but our path required patience and the painful nourishment of bureaucracy. There were threats. A letter came one morning tied to my gate. "Leave now, and no more trouble." The handwriting was swift and practiced. They had sent men to other homesteads, pressing the same notices, the same thin mercy. The corporation's reach was a web. There were also whispers that the marshal would be paid to look the other way when things got messy. That was a familiar fear. Men in suits have long used the law as both blade and bar. In the quiet hours, when the house felt like a chest of sleeping things, I held the ledger and the choices it offered like a woman holding a newborn, with love and with fear. I had to lead, and leading was not something you did with fury alone. It required the steadiness I'd practiced for years. Listen, document, protect witnesses, and make sure the women who testified had places to go if forced out. Financial independence was no small part of our plan. If we could find a way to secure land titles as women's property, if we could turn the frontier's casual dispossession into something recorded under women's names, we would have more than words. We would have permanence. The marshal's 30 days ticked like a metronome. We pushed at the doors of the law step by step. Gideon moved through lines of men and knights, collecting names in the ledger and discovering new pages of expense. He brought me names of investigators who were paid to be blind, and I brought the community the courage to speak. My plan had become not a woman's solo temper tantrum, but a coordinated attempt at institutional correction. "Whatever we do," Maria said at one late meeting, "we do it together." And so we did. The ledger became less Gideon's singular object and more a communal tool. I was the one holding the map, but every woman who offered her story helped chart the course. I would not be the only voice. If men in authority had misused law, we would answer with a different use of it, grassroots, patient, and inexorable. My fight then was not only for me, it was for the way my people kept their names in the land. The plan took shape like a cobbled road, uneven but serviceable. We split tasks by talent and temperament. Lottie became our recorder and liaison. Her neat handwriting was a thing of power, a steady proof when accusations tried to claw back word. Maria used her boarding house as a hub for women who needed shelter while they testified. Cora gathered cattle and supplies when the fear of forced removal had the iron taste of winter. Gideon worked among the railmen, collecting evidence with a quiet tenacity, while I kept the ledger secure and coached the women who would stand at court. Our nights were long with strategy. We created a timeline, each entry cross-referenced with witness testimony and receipts. If a man had been paid to assist a relocation in April, for instance, we would match it to a woman who had received a notice in March and a deputy who had been assigned to that county in April. Gideon taught me how to read the margins of a ledger, like a man reads a map. Where the ink was paler, the paper was likely to have been copied. Where the edge of the page was torn, the item was likely contentious. I taught him how to coax a woman into telling a story without her feeling like she had to prove the weight of what she'd lost. We were complementary forces, his outlaw cunning to extract hidden questions, my patient craft to make an answer solicitous. We trained together, which is how our intimacy grew, not in the clumsy fumblings of novelty, but in the slow grind of purpose. Gideon learned the names of the herbs and their uses, the ribbon of peppermint that helps digestion, the willow bark that eases pain. And I taught him how to wrap a wound and soothe the trembling of a woman who had been threatened. His hands, once quicker to lock, became slower and more deliberate, learning to hold a patient's hand and keep talking in the way that made fear thin. He learned to listen. I learned to let a man be necessary without letting him think he's the final answer. "Why do you stay?" he asked me one twilight as we pieced together a particularly thorny cluster of payments that showed the marshal's hand in more than one county. The light pooled on the ledger like a small lake. "Because somebody has to," I said, "and because it's mine." It was a selfish thing to admit in front of him. I wasn't trying to be noble. I was simply making the ledger do what it had to do, not to save his skin, but to save the people I serve. He tilted his chin in that slightly rueful way he had. "If we win," he said, "what will you want?" A question like that can be dangerous. In my experience, you don't ask a patient what they want when they're gasping for breath. But his question was gentler. I thought of the land, of a field I could call by the name my grandmother had given it. I thought of a place where Lottie could teach and not have to worry about a surveyor. I thought about the boarding house that would continue to put food on Maria's table. I thought of my own heart, which had begun to keep a new kind of company. "I want to keep this land and make it a place where others like us can have a place to come home to," I answered. "Then we'll make that happen," Gideon said, as if the promise was small and doable. He was not blind to the obstacles. He had seen men fat on the ease of corruption. But he said it anyway, as if the promise itself might carve the path. We worked to ensure that the women who spoke in court had safe places to stay. If they had to leave their homes in the short term, Maria's boarding house often took them in for a discounted rate. Lottie coached them on the clarity of testimony, how to say what needed to be said and not let anger make a liar of them. Cora and the few men in our orbit who could be trusted lent muscle to protect witness testimony days when we feared the marshal's men might try to scare people into silence. One of the most profound things that happened during this period was how the women began to teach each other. A woman who had learned to iron differently shared her method with another whose hands shook. A midwife showed a young mother how to keep a child from catching a draft. A retired schoolteacher began to teach small reading classes in the evening. And those classes became a place where reports and testimony were practiced in the form of storytelling. The ledger that Gideon had brought into my attic began to be less a private thing and more a communal artifact, treated carefully, discussed calmly, used strategic. Romance grew in the margins of our work like a sweet plant that wasn't meant to take up a lot of space, but took up some anyway. Gideon had a way of looking at me that did not seek to own. He sought to see. Over time, the guard I kept around my heart softened, not because he fixed me, but because he respected the parts of me that had been broken and did not pretend to mend them with a hand on mine. He learned when to be quiet and when to insist that I sleep. He learned how to fetch water and how to wrap his fingers around my wrist to steady a difficult moment of testimony. I learned his history, not to excuse him, but to understand how it shaped his willingness to help. There were moments when his impulsiveness clashed with my patience. He wanted sometimes to storm into a surveyor's office and drag a man out by the collar. I wanted a plan. We argued, sometimes heatedly. He did not resent being told to wait when I had a strategy. Instead, he began to trust my judgment as a necessary counterbalance to his appetite for direct action. In the end, it was our shared purpose that smoothed the disagreements. One day, after a particularly long afternoon of taking witness statements, Gideon surprised me with a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a jagged stone carved like a feather. An old thing, maybe a trinket from my grandmother's time. "For luck," he said. And although such things had little superstition for me, I took it because he had chosen it with care. We were equals in the most stubborn way. Neither demanded subservience from the other. He respected the authority I had earned in my community, and I gave him room to atone for his past with action rather than censure. Our partnership was not the storybook rescue. He did not save me, and I did not fix him. We bolstered one another, learning through every small victory that two people choosing the same horizon can go farther than one. In time, the ledger swelled with connections and corroborations. We had enough to threaten a legal case, but more difficult than obtaining evidence was the decision to take this fight into the public record. Men with money tended to use money to silence problems. We needed more than a courthouse suit. We needed to ensure that the truth could not be washed away with a bag of coin. We would need to expose the corruption in public by convincing people with ink-stained hands that they would lose more if they sided with the thieves than if they sided with justice. The autumn rain had made the dirt of the road into a map of small, uncertain rivers. The 30 days the marshal had given me were nearly at an end. The notice sat like a fossil on my shelf, its edges nicked and expectation worn thin. We had a case assembled, a lattice of testimonies, receipts and ledger lines that suggested a system of theft and intimidation. We had a plan for presenting it at court, accompanied by public testimony. But there was always the moment when courage meets consequence, and you have to decide if the fight is your fight to choose. We had, in our arsenal, two paths that diverged like a trail through the cottonwood. One was safer: file a quiet suit, challenge the paperwork in court, use our documentation to pry open a small victory. It would take time, money, and a faith that the legal system still held some reverence for the truth. The other was riskier and louder: publicize the ledger to make the corruption an affair of the town. Newspapers, town meetings, the square that held gossip like a net. If the people were outraged enough, the company would find it harder to work quietly. But exposing things could bring violence. It could bring men in suits with hired hands who had no patience for Defies. I sat at the table that night with Lottie, Maria, and Gideon. We drank tea and measured the weight of our options, like women measuring bolts of fabric by the light. Maria worried that public censure would bring trouble for her boarding house. Lottie feared a town meeting that would be stacked with men who had been paid to speak. Gideon, who had once been an agent of the system itself, drew a long breath and said something I did not expect. "You must choose, Aiyana. Whatever you choose, I will back you." It was an act of submission, not to me, but to the fact of my agency. It mattered more than he'd known. The ledger had made him a kind of map, but it was my life and the lives of the women who had trusted me at stake. Choosing was not about whether I could withstand fear. Choosing was about defining the kind of woman I would be, one who ran when the night grew cold, or one who stood her ground. In the quiet of my small room that night, I thought of the seasons. A woman does not hold land only for herself. She holds it for the people who have no one to hold theirs. I thought of the graves that lined the riverbank where our ancestors had been buried, and how they would be uprooted for a steel beam if we allowed it. I thought of Lottie, who taught children the alphabet, and Cora, whose cattle fed those children. I could not be content with slow justice if slow justice meant the erasure of a people's place on the map. But I also could not be reckless. So I chose both. I chose a tactic that would protect as much as it would expose. We would take the ledger to court, legally, patiently, while simultaneously preparing the town for truth. Lottie would publish a careful account through a small, sympathetic press that printed pamphlets for anti-corruption causes. Maria would prepare the boarding house to host witnesses safely. Gideon would press quietly at the edges, planting the ledger's details with a reporter who had an old grudge against the railroads. We would go to the courthouse with our evidence in hand and a town behind us, ready to receive the truth. The choice was not without its small, private sacrifices. I began to imagine a life without my house if things turned, and that thought was a hard stone under my tongue. If the marshal moved against us, we might lose everything before the ink dried on any order. Yet the alternative, letting the railroad men write our story, seemed like surrender. We allowed ourselves a brief and dangerous indulgence, a night of imagined futures. Gideon and I walked the ridge behind the house where the sky opened like a plate. He spoke not in plans now, but in possibility. "If we win," he said, tracing a line in the dirt with his toe, "you could keep this land. We could build a proper room for the school and plant an orchard." I looked at him and imagined for a moment a life that was not defined by lists and laws. I imagined a woman who could plant not just for survival, but for beauty. I imagined a partner who would plow beside me, not in the patronizing way of a suitor, but as someone whose hands were calloused by work and whose eyes were anchored in respect. The dream was small and enormous all at once. Gideon did not sweep me away in promises. He offered no dramatic rescues. He offered instead a companionship that said, "I will stand with you while you choose." He placed his hand over mine, steady and precise. "Whatever you choose," he said again, "I'll help, not because you need it, but because I want to stand with you." That was the decisive thing. It was not that he would rescue me, it was that he refused to let me stand alone. He had his own ledger to clear, but in supporting me, he recognized that his redemption could be a mutual one. I chose then to make the fight public and methodical. We would trust the women to speak and the law to do what it feared it might not. We would train our witnesses until their voices were weapons of truth. The calm before the storm tasted like the sweet flesh of a quince, tempting, fragrant, fragile. There were small moments of happiness. Gideon learned to whistle a tune that my grandmother had hummed by the stove. Lottie brought a class of children by who recited the alphabet as if it were a prayer. These moments were not naive. They were the seed money of courage. We prepared, we practiced, we set the ledger in the chest beneath the floor where it could be retrieved and displayed with dignity. As the day of the court hearing came closer, I felt a strange kind of peace. Making the choice had taken the sharpness off the uncertainty. The fear remained like the taste of iron, but the choice had seeded an intention in me that did not depend on Gideon or any man to fit. It depended on me, on my voice, my leadership, and the women I had bound to the cause. That is all a leader can ask for when the world finally asks you to stand in the place you were meant to guard. When you decide to stand, you often discover the amount of leverage a system can wield to inconvenience and intimidate. The men with suits did not leave the ledger alone. They pulled strings like puppeteers who were used to being obeyed. A rumor began to run through the town like water, that the women making complaints had been paid by outside agitators, that the ledger was a forgery, that the marshal's notice had been the law of the land, and anyone who resisted would face consequences. We expected some of that. What we did not expect was the speed at which men were willing to turn to brutality. One afternoon, a group of hired men came through the outskirts, surveying the houses with a disrespect that made my blood cold. They measured the sycamore and laughed about the native superstitions, the way a man might flick loose a cobweb. A deputy I'd thought better of leaned his hip against my fence and joked about making quick work of those who stubbornly cling to their dirt. There were whispers that Gideon's earlier life had not been as noble as he had claimed, which is the convenient way to discredit a man who would stand for the opposite of what the railroad men wanted. The ledger, they said, had been planted. They accused us of stirring trouble for profit. Letters were sent to towns beyond ours, warning them that we were a hotbed for dissent. The marshal's men started showing up more frequently at the edges of town, ostensibly to protect their interests. It was worse, though, in the private ways. Maria's boarding house received a notice that her taxes had accidentally been increased. Cora's cattle were rustled in the night. 2 were found days later, their throats cut, a trumpet of a threat to anyone who might resist. A woman who had agreed to testify found her window broken and a note tied to a stone. "We know where you sleep." The ledger, once a secret fear, was now a live ember in the public square. We had expected the company to try muddying the water, but we had underestimated the speed with which men for hire would try to frighten us into silence. When Gideon returned from a trip to the county seat with news that a clerk had been paid off to move one of the ledgers, I felt the old pain of loss like a stone in my throat. But there was no time for despair. The women and I gathered under the sycamore, where Lottie had set up a table with a globe of paper. We made lists. Who needed safe houses? Who could be called for witness protection? Which farmers had fences good enough to hide a hiding place if we needed one? We divided labor like midwives in a birthing room, calm, decisive, each aware of the other's moves. Gideon suggested something that made my ribs ache with worry. He proposed a small raid to reclaim a set of papers that had been taken to the company office for filing. It's not violent, he said. We slip in at night, retrieve what they were careless enough to leave, and prove by possession that their papers don't match what they claim. I saw the logic. I also saw the danger. If you do this and they catch you, they will take you in and hang you up as an example, I said. My voice did not waver, but my heart roared like a trapped animal. Yet I knew the ledger alone would not suffice. Possession would make the papers real in ways ink alone could not. Having copies might not have the same legal standing as the original. He looked at me with an odd mix of resignation and determination. You've given me a chance to be useful, Aiyana. I don't want to waste. We decided to temper the plan with caution. A small team, Gideon, a quiet-eyed man named Thomas, who owed me a life in the form of a healed daughter, and 2 others who could be trusted, would go in at night. Maria would keep the boarding house lights low, and Lottie would prepare statements that could be read in the case of a raid. The idea of women preparing for a raid was not heroic in the way legends paint it. It was meticulous. We made contingency plans, safe words, and the night the team set out, the air was thin and bright with moon. I stood in the doorway of my house and watched them go, each figure a careful. The next morning dawned with the news that the office had been broken into, but that the papers were gone. There was also a second story. A deputy had been injured in the scuffle, and the company had responded with the speed of a wounded beast, rallying their men and swearing in a posse. The town's mood shifted like a floor that had tilted. The escalation was immediate. The marshal called for calm and promised to mediate. The company held a meeting and accused us of criminal behavior. Men who had taken the easy way in life found righteous indignation suddenly more profitable. Witnesses who had been wavering felt the pressure and retreated. They took down their names and left the town in the middle of the night. I realized then that the battle was not only against the men with suits, but against fear itself. Fear eats people. It makes people believe lies because lies are easier than the risk of life itself. We had to hold steady in the middle of the storm, to be patient and persistent enough that truth would outlast intimidation. It meant practical things, sheltering women in remote cabins, making sure each witness had a place to go, and having people outside town ready to take statements if the courthouse doors were closed. But there was also a moral complication. The company's men began to use my Comanche background as a cudgel. They whispered about savage ways, and one of the company papers ran a piece questioning the legitimacy of my ownership because of my bloodline. It was a vicious attempt to shame me publicly. The ledger attacks became personal. They wanted to make me small because smallness is easier to dismiss. Their slander stung, yes, but it also hardened me. We were forced to broaden our strategy. Lottie wrote op-eds and distributed them, and a sympathetic editor in the neighboring township agreed to reprint the ledger's salient parts. A few honest men, tradesmen and farmers who had been cheated in other contracts, began to speak out. When the company men realized the fight could affect their reputations, their approach shifted from brute force to legal maneuvers. I felt the old fear, loss of land, loss of friends, the possibility of violence circling in the night. But I also felt the presence of women standing in my house, sewing, arranging comforts, and making sure the ledger did not disappear into the evening. Female solidarity, the steady, patient labor of a community refusing to be cast aside, became our most reliable weapon against their well-funded aggression. We adapted. We made sure every witness had a backup testimony and that copies of what we had were stored in places outside town. We kept the ledger not under glass, but under the floor, because the best concealment is ordinary things that hide in plain sight. We learned to move under the radar, to use the very ordinary work of women, cooking, mending, trading, as a cover for our resistance. Yet despite our preparation, the air thickened with a sense of impending catastrophe. Their forces had tightened their circle, and Gideon's past had given them a line to question. The town that had been our place of small public joys, children learning letters under Lottie's patient eyes, Maria's boarding house full of laughter, now tasted of menace. It was then the company sent a final message. The marshal gave us 1 week to vacate. Their patience had ended, their violence would be unapologetic. It was the darkest hour before the storm. We had planned carefully, we had allies, and we had, crucially, no illusion. The road ahead would be a fight, but we had chosen to stand its middle. If we were to win, it would be because we were smarter and steadier, because we could use small kindnesses as armor and the ledger as a spear. If we lost, it would be because men with money had more patience than we did. Either way, I did not intend to be moved quietly. I thought of my grandmother's hands again, the way she'd cupped my face and said, "You keep your eye." I kept them now, and I would use them to watch and choose when to strike. There is a particular kind of night that proves whether a person is made of brittle glass or tempered steel. It had that smell, tallow and wet wool, and the kind of silence that announces people listening. The week given by the marshal had dwindled into tight hours. Men with firm jaws now loitered by the post. Gideon had gone to town to find the reporter who had promised to run our story. His absence tightened the ache in the house like a hand on a Then the betrayal came. Tomas, the man who had helped Gideon in the night raid, had been quiet and careful. He had a daughter whose cough I had tended and whom he loved in a way that made you forgive his mistakes. But he was also someone who listened to promise. A man with silver eyes and cleaner speech had offered Tomas a way out, for his daughter's sake, a small separation from a life that looked like endless risk. The kind of promise that men with money make to poor men who sleep. Tomas took the offer. The company men were patient and ruthless. They promised him a new homestead in a far-off town, a deed in exchange for silence. Tomas, desperate for his daughter's future, took it and turned on us. He pointed out a place where Gideon had once visited and told where the ledger could be found. In the morning, men came with keys and searched my house. They found the chest beneath the floor. I was in the garden when they came, my hands in the earth, and I heard the sound of my world shifting in the way you hear a jar. Maria ran across the yard, her apron full of dough like some talisman of North. She grabbed my arm and whispered, "They're inside." By the time I burst through the back door, the men had the chest and were rifling through pages as if it were a buff. Gideon was nowhere to be seen. The marshal's face was a storm of polite denial. "We're just securing evidence," he said. "We can't have vigilante gangs dragging men around." They had their reasons. They had the ledger, and they also had their lies. The ledger, the evidence that had been our tool, was now theirs to catalogue and worse, they had photographed pages and made copies to distribute a narrative of their own. We were undone by bureaucracy and by a man whose love for his child had been used like a bridle. I let the men do their searching because there was no place for a woman to be hysterical in front of a magistrate's men. I let my hands go steady and methodical. I took notes of the men who had entered. I memorized their fate. In the afternoon, the marshal left with the chest and a suitcase of papers. He said, cool as a man buying apples, that an investigation would follow. He promised protection for those who had given testimony, but protection under the law had become a paper shield, not a sword. Then came the worst of it. One of our key witnesses, Sarah, who had scheduled to speak the next day, was taken. The company claimed they had reason to arrest her for disturbing the peace. She was held in a cell that smelled like old stone, and they used every trick to discredit her. Claims that she had been paid by a rival landowner, rumors that her husband beat her. Lies spread like spilled ink and dampened the courage of Gideon returned 2 days later, his face raw with guilt and worry. They had the ledger, he said. They ghosted it, made a copy of what suited them, and left the rest in a safe I couldn't pry. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, the tremor of a man who had been beaten in ways legal men find convenient. Thomas betrayed us, he added, and the name hit me like a frost. I had stitched Thomas's daughter's arm once. I had fed him. He had chosen the security of a deed over the pulse of a community. I wanted to throw things. I wanted to lay hands on each man who had taken what we'd gathered and torn it to suit. Instead, I steadied myself and did the things that a healer does. I made sure Sarah did not break under interrogation. I sat by her cell and warmed her with broth. I taught her to pace her breathing so that when the time came to speak, she would not be swallowed by nerves. The ledger was ruined as a pristine artifact, but human testimony is amorphous and uncontained. It could be reshaped. Witnesses once told a story, keep telling it. Lies are brittle if enough people speak a different truth. But the setbacks mounted. The company filed injunctions. The marshal's patience thinned until it resembled anger. Deputies were more visible, and friends began to leave. Some terrified, some paid to leave. The farmhouse was less a home and more of a target. The night my roof caught on fire, arson we believed, though the company claimed it was accidental, I stood in the yard and watched the flames lick at the rafters. The house was a skeleton, and memory rained down in empty. I saved what I could, my grandmother's weaving, the jar of tinctures that had become the backbone of my small trade, and the rest turned to ash. There is a peculiar loneliness in watching your history burn. It makes you light and very, very small. I sat on the ground with my hands blackened and thought of leaving, of getting a wagon and gathering what was portable, of going to a place where the word Comanche did not serve as a Gideon lifted me off the ground then and carried me like a man who was learning to be delicately brave. He did not try to fix the ruin with words. He packed the remaining jars, wrapped the ledger fragments in oilcloth, and looked at me like someone learning the gravity of devotion. "Stay," he said, which was not an order. It was a, "We can put it back to, we can," I echoed. But my voice was the brittle thing of a woman who had been pushed to the. I was tempted to run, to accept the deed they'd offered as a bribe to depart. But the way my land felt in my palms, even ash-laden, made leaving a betrayal to my grandmother and to the women who trusted. I stood up then, shaking like a sapling in a gale, and made the choice that would define me. I would not let the ledger's fragments define the limits of justice. I would use the people themselves, witnesses, memories, names on lists, and knit them into something the company could not incinerate. It would be harder now, yes, but I had something else. A cadre of women whose resolve had been honed by necessity. Gideon swore then that he would find the copies the company had hidden, and that if it meant he had to break into a safe at the risk of hanging, he would do it. His voice was raw, and for the first time I saw in him the pale edges of. "You won't be alone," I said. "Not." He nodded, and the small gesture, agreement without subjugation, felt like a truce between two broken things learning to be whole together. That night, as I lay awake under a blanket threadbare from soot, I felt the soil under my nails in a way I hadn't before. The land was not merely dirt. It held memory and names. It was stubborn, like me. I resolved then to make our case out of what could not be burned. community, testimony, and the stubborn law that, even when corrupted, could be used by people who would not be intimidated out of truth. When the law becomes a tool of convenience, the people must become a forge. We were knocked down and had to stand up raw and smarter. The burn of the house had taught me what can't be destroyed: faces and voices. The ledger's fragments were now more like talismans, proof that had been sullied, yes, but proof still. And though the company had tried to make our evidence their own, they had exposed themselves. Men had been caught in a lie by their own arrogance. That arrogance would be their undoing. I convened a council beneath the sycamore, and we did what women do best. We set tasks with the clarity of midwives organizing a delivery. We would no longer depend only on documents and we would use what was indestructible: testimony and the relentless truth of lived experience. Lottie crafted a public forum, an open day at the square, to be held just before the court hearing. We would invite anyone who wanted to hear a story. We would also prepare an alternating path. We would find a sympathetic lawyer in the neighboring county who had not yet been charmed by the company men. He existed, of course. Every empire has a few misfits. Gideon worked nights as he did best. He found, by talking to the right men in the right taverns, that copies of the ledger had made their way into a clerk's trunk in the company office in the next town. "They've been careless," he said, lighting a cigarette one evening with rough fingers. "They think themselves clever because they own the law, but law magnifies carelessness if you know where to look." His plan was a small group, him, Thomas, redeemed by a returned conscience, and two other men who owed me favors, would infiltrate the company's archive at night and retrieve the exact copies the company had used to paint their story. It would be a theft of documents that would put them at risk, but it would also provide the material to show how the company had manipulated the papers to their advantage. I could have forbidden it. I could have insisted the law be used in the daylight only. But sometimes the law needs an assist from those who have nothing left to lose. We coordinated our moves. Maria hosted travelers who were more than they seemed. Cora drove cattle to create diversion. Lottie wrote. The women who had once been reduced to quiet tasks became the scaffolding for a moral recovery. On the night of the infiltration, the men moved like ghosts. They slipped into the locked archives and found the trunk. It was heavy and Gideon handed me the documents in the morning like an offering. I spread the pages on my table and watched the truth open like a map. The company had used copies of deeds, twisted signatures with the help of a hurried clerk, and used an unknowing deputy's stamps like a seal. There was the forgery, neat as a stitched seam, and there was also a small, damning invoice where the company had paid hush money to a local We had what we needed to make the company's own processes betray. But evidence is still the husk. What feeds justice is testimony. So we grew bolder in our outreach. We devised a day when Lottie would convene a public meeting and read select sections, while the lawyer filed a motion to introduce the authenticated copies as forgery evidence. We contacted a sympathetic journalist in the county seat who promised to run the story if we could guarantee the safety of witnesses. The day we stood up to the company in public, the square was the size of a small sea of faces. People had come from other towns, drawn by the scandalous taste of falsehood. Maria distributed bread and made it possible for a dozen women to stay the day without worrying about meals. Lottie stood with me and read. Her voice was steady as a rod. Women who had left now returned to stand with us, their faces telling a catalogue of it. A teacher testified that the company surveyors had purposely excluded a patch of ground sacred to us. A widow spoke of being handed a relocation notice while a deputy stood by and laughed. The witnesses were not polished, but they were true. The square listened. The company's men tried to shout over us. Their lawyers attempted to file motions of obfuscation. But the presence of many witnesses, the copies of the ledger we now held, and the reporter's column had made the company appear like a man trying to hide a wound with flour. ineffectual, and obviously. The real turning point came not at a gavel, but in a courtroom where a judge, cowed at first by the company's money, found himself looking at an authenticated ledger, multiple witnesses, and a public that refused to be. He had to weigh the law's dignity against the company's attempt to trample it. He chose to let the case proceed, yet we did not take a courthouse victory for granted. I led a small group of women, Maria, Lottie, Cora, and several others, who were capable of testifying. We rehearsed our words until they were as clean as a bone. We understood that our strength lay not only in what we had suffered, but in our dignity while telling. A woman who tells a truth straight is a dangerous thing to men who depend on complexity. On the last day of the trial, we presented the company copies and our witness. Gideon sat a little distance from me in the gallery, his weathered face leaning forward like a man who had learned to focus on the thing that mattered. He did not speak. He knew the stage he had been given was to prepare proof, not to take center stage. He had been asked once to be quiet, and he had learned to be an instrument of our aims. The cross-examination was brutal. Lawyers are trained to find the human crack. But each woman held her ground. Lottie, the schoolteacher, spoke about the dates and her notes, the very ones that lined up with the ledger. Maria produced receipts from the days when company clerks had been paid. Cora testified about cattle and how survey lines had crossed grazing land that had never been. The judge. The evidence spoke. When the ruling came, it felt like the slow turning of a mill wheel. The judge found that there had been enough evidence to suggest that the company's claims were suspect and ordered a temporary injunction against forced relocations pending a fuller investigation. It was not a final victory, but it was a reprieve, and it allowed us to breathe without the constant iron pressure of an impending. People cried in the courthouse lobby, and I felt a hand squeeze. Gideon stood then, and for the first time in public leaned toward me, and without ceremony kissed the knuckle of my thumb. It was small, private, and perfectly equal. We had won something vital, not the entire market, not the world, but a margin, a space where we could live. The women around me were not only relieved, they were changed. They had spoken and been heard. They had used testimony as a weapon and tenderness as armor. My house would be repaired with the community's. Maria's boarding house would be free of tax harassment for now. We had a small orchard planted in the place where ash had been, and the saplings were cared for like miniature oaths. Gideon's redemption was not neat. He did not preach it to me or to others. He worked quietly and with a tenacity that had steadied in the light of. We did not become a fairy tale of perfect people because no one in my life was perfect. He had vices. I had. But he had learned to hold his past in his hands and make it a tool rather than a chain. It was also then that other women began to come to my house, women from farther away who had heard our story and wanted to learn how to gather evidence and protect their rights. I began to teach them how to document injuries, how to preserve receipts, how to make testimony sing. I taught them how to make salves and how to use their. The orchard of saplings and the repaired house became our classroom and our symbol. I had risen not because a man had pulled me up, but because I had pulled myself up with the willing strength of many hands. The ledger had been the spark, but the fire that saved the land was the accumulated warmth of voices that refused to be. I had led, not alone, but as the one who kept. The partnership with Gideon had matured into mutual respect, and in that respect I found not submission, but choice. Justice is a knot that takes a long time to untie. By the time the company called its men to the courthouse for a final reckoning, the town had become a place where truth's echo could not be ignored. We had not triumphed by overturning the entire corporation in a single day, but we had set things in motion that made corruption. The company's leaders were exposed in a form of witnesses and documents, and their attempts to smear us had backfired in spectacular. The final hearing was long and hot. Lawyers packed into the courtroom like storm clouds. Lottie had prepared bundles of testimony. Maria had organized a group of women to attend. Cora had brought a farmer who had logged the dates when surveyors had trespassed. Gideon sat beside me, his hand a warm instrument of solidarity on my thigh, a small, steadying pressure that said he was there because he chose to be. At one point, a company lawyer sneered that our evidence was circumstantial, that ledger fragments and women's memories were an insufficient basis for accusation. He pushed a paper across the table, waving it like a challenge. The judge, who had been trained to listen to both sides and weigh them as if balance were neutral, leaned back. He was an older man with a stack of letters on his bench, a man who had been raised on the idea that facts, if persistent, will eventually impose themselves. Lottie rose first. She read a testimony with such clear calm that even the lawyer's sneer seemed stranded. She read receipts with dates that matched the ledger, and the links between payments and relocation assistance became a chain that had been forged for. Maria described how men had been shown documents and pressured under the guise of official decree. Cora brought maps and cattle records, and a retired surveyor who had been tipped by guilt testified that he had altered a route at the company's behest. Then they called Gideon. He did not dramatize his life. He simply took the stand and told, in plain terms, how he had found the ledger, how he'd sought to expose wrongdoing, and how the company had retaliated. His voice was steady, but held that texture of someone who had tasted fear often. When he explained the mechanics of the company's document manipulation, the courtroom leaned in. His insider knowledge lent the prosecutors a tool to show that this wasn't a random conspiracy theory, but a pattern of deliberate fraud. In the end, the judge's ruling was a long, written thing. He found sufficient evidence to issue indictments for falsifying documents, coercion in relocations, and paying officials to overlook irregularities. A handful of company men were arrested on the spot. Their collars felt like ropes being drawn. The public shaming was as effective an instrument as the law itself. Men who had banked on anonymity found their names chased like dogs in the newspaper. We had forced them to make their injustice manifest in a space where it could not be hidden. The company had thought itself impervious to public opinion and law combined. They had miscalculated. They did not anticipate the moral force of women who had learned to speak as witnesses and who could hold their ground in a courtroom with calm dignity. The victory was not wholly legal triumph. There were bargains and deals, and a few men fled with what they could stash. But the principle was established. Land could not be taken by a piece of paper and a smile when witnesses and evidence contradicted it. We had preserved our corner of the map. The court ordered a restitution process and formalized protections for lodgings designated as safe houses for threatened witnesses. The company's board issued statements that tried to adjust language and claimed they had acted within the law. But the ink of law was not the same as the weight of public record. For the first time in many hard years, I felt the ground beneath me not as an enemy, but as an ally. I will not claim the victory made everything right. Some damage was already done. Some lives had been displaced and could not be returned. Tomas had left town, red-faced and empty-handed. The house that had burned was rebuilt slowly over the next seasons with the help of the women who came to lend their hands. The orchard we planted grew, stubborn as the hope that fed it. Gideon and I did not become a storybook couple with a tidy ending in a single day. We had gentle arguments about finances. He wanted to put the money from the lawsuit into a travel chest for disappearing when necessary. I wanted it to buy better seeds and a small stock of medicines to trade for the neighbors. We compromised like mature people. We decided to invest in the land and in the community rather than in our own imagined retreat. The romantic part of our story, because there was a romance, did not feel like a rescue. We walked it like partners. He had learned how to be present without patronizing, how to listen and step back when I needed to lead. I had learned to let him perform acts of bravery without requiring he do so for me. When he kissed my hand in the courthouse lobby after the ruling, it was a small, private benediction. I chose him because he was useful and because he was kind. But mostly, I chose him because in the hard work of justice, he had proven himself worthy of a place at my side. Our community continued to recover. The school had new supplies bought by the restitution funds. Maria's boarding house prospered as people realized her kitchen was a place of refuge. Women who had testified were offered legal protection and were included in a small fund we created to ensure none of them were left without a roof. I opened an apothecary in town that served as both my livelihood and a place for women to learn remedies and, crucially, to keep records. Legal recognition of our rights was still a fragile thing, but it was anchored by the people who now had seen the ledger and the truth behind it. We had achieved justice not by clean swords, but by patience, by the willingness of women to stand and speak, and by the quiet cunning of an outlaw who chose to use his past as a tool. It was not a victory over men. It was a victory for ways of being that refused to be condescended to. It was proof that when a community holds its common life as valuable, the law can be made to serve it. 2 years later, I stood on the porch of a house patched with many hands and looked at the small orchard thriving where the ash had once burned. The sycamore had regrown, leaves dense and green like a promise kept. My hair bore more silver, and there were new lines around my eyes that came from smiling more than from worry. I had learned that scars could be worn like medals without their weight defeating you. The land was in my name now, my deed, recorded in the courthouse as Aiyana of the River Homestead. It was not a gift. It was the result of countless small acts, careful petitions, and the courage of women who had spoken truth. My apothecary had a front window where bundles of dried herbs hung like trophies. I had a ledger of my own, a more honest one, tracking patients and treatments, and a shelf for notes where the children of the town could come and trade chores for lessons in reading and botany. Lottie taught twice a week in the schoolroom. Maria ran the boarding house with a flourish, and Cora managed a cooperative of cattlewomen whose profits were split fairly. We had turned property into security and security into independence. Women had bought small plots in their names, and the idea of female property ownership became less radical and more practical, a defense against future men with casual plans for our lives. Gideon and I built something that was not a castle, but a shared refuge. He worked now in town when needed, and with me when the land called. Our partnership was a woven thing of respect and tenderness. We argued and made up like people who know it is better to share blow for blow than to hold grudges. He respected my decisions about the apothecary and the school. I respected his contributions and his need to have a place where he was recognized for more than the ledger. We had both saved ourselves and saved each other in the ways the heart needs. Company in the risk, steady hands in the fear, equal standing in the consequences and joys. The outlaw man had his redemption in the steady things. He helped manage the cooperative. He learned bookkeeping so the women could rely on fair ledgers, and he taught some of the men in town the dignity of honest labor. He did not deserve or demand forgiveness. He earned it. That was the essence of what we had built. Mutual making, mutual repair, a partnership grounded in the sort of love that grows in trenches and kitchens and courtrooms. Women arrived to learn from us. They traveled from towns where the railroad's shadow still stretched long and asked me how we had managed the ledger, how we'd protected witnesses, and how we'd forged a network strong enough to withstand bought deputies. I taught them the trade of documentation and the map of legal recourse. We established a small guild, and through it, women traded expertise, midwifery for bookkeeping, tinctures for testimony preparation. Female solidarity became an institution that no parade of suits could fade. There were moments, late afternoons when the sun painted the orchard gold, that I thought of everything I'd lost. The memory of my husband's quiet laugh haunted the edges like a pale bird. But those edges no longer made me small. They framed what I had chosen to build. I had been broken, yes, but the broken pieces had become the foundation for a house I would live in, not a cage to keep me prisoner. I had learned to make difficult choices and to accept help when it honored rather than erased me. Gideon and I married in the small, practical ceremony of people who knew vows meant work. Lottie read a passage about the endurance of gardens. Maria baked bread. Cora led the procession. Our marriage was a joining of equals. I did not take his name because I needed him, but because we chose to be known together and as separate too. We negotiated finances, chores, and respect with the easy confidence of people who had already bared their souls in court and had been judged ultimately on their deeds, not their promises. Our orchard grew and the apothecary thrived. More importantly, the community thrummed with new possibilities. The school had added a small roof over the playground. A women's bank, humble, resilient, opened in the room above Maria's boarding house. We had not overturned the world. We had made a corner of it steadier for the next generation. And yet, the final lesson I had learned in the storm was fundamental. You do not have to be flawless to be powerful. You do not need you to be rescued. I was not cured of sorrow. Sorrow had become a companion that taught me how to sit with the ache without letting it dictate my life. I was older, wiser, worn in the places that mattered. Now to you, who listen and who have perhaps been told you are too old, too small, or too broken to matter, this is your mirror. This is what a woman who has been knocked down and refused to stay down looks like. I am not an ideal. I am a woman who chose to stand and to make room for others to stand beside her. And so her story ends where yours can continue. She was told she was expendable, but she proved otherwise. She was meant to be moved, but she remained. She was supposed to be silent, but she found her voice and taught others to speak. If you are a woman who has been knocked down but refused to stay down, if you believe it is never too late to claim your place on the map, if you understand that the strongest love is built between equals who lift each other up, then you have found your people.